Hi, and welcome to the Improved Garage YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be doing a bunch of different videos. The first one is going to be removing the aftermarket alarm from the Project Corolla. So we'll pull that here into the garage and we'll talk a little bit about why I'm removing it, and I'll kind of walk you through an aftermarket alarm system removal and some of the things that you might come across. All right, so we're just going to kind of start off with a background and some why. So I picked up this Toyota Corolla as a fleet vehicle for a local IT company. And it's a 2009, it has 130-ish thousand miles on it. This company purchased it from CarMax in, I think it was like 2014 or 2015, according to the title. So they owned it for 6 or 7 years. COVID adjusted the amount of vehicles that they needed in certain locations, and then they also wanted to change. They wanted to get a Ford Transit for a vehicle, so they were looking to trade this on a Transit and do something different. And I ended up just buying it from them for basically what the trade-in value that they were getting for the Transit was. So what I was told, the reason why they were getting rid of it in the first place is because there's an electrical issue. And, electrical issue can mean a variety of things. And historically, so I spent a lot of time working at a shop that installed aftermarket electronics, car stereos, remote starters, alarm systems, things like what I'm going to be removing today. And what I found over the years working there is that most mechanics are not electricians. And that's not meant to be mean or harsh or anything like that. It's a different skill set than what they trained for. Similarly, most electricians are not mechanics, and that's okay. So my background is in electrical, and what I was told with this particular car is that there's an electrical issue, that they leave it, the people don't drive it a lot because they had two Corollas and one of them had Bluetooth and one of them did not. This is the one without Bluetooth. So nobody really drives it. And then it sits, and then the battery's dead, and they replaced the battery about a year ago, and then they replaced the battery again like 2 months ago. So I have a brand new battery, which is kind of cool. And they took it to the mechanic because the battery kept going dead, but they really weren't driving the car, so it's kind of to be expected. And the car has an aftermarket alarm system. And the aftermarket alarm system, you can get alarm systems that are set up a variety of different ways. So you can get an alarm system that has like door open sensors. If you open the door, it goes off. If you open the hood, it goes off. If you open the trunk, it goes off. And then you can get something more sensitive that has like a glass break sensor, which is basically a microphone that listens inside the car for a loud noise, listening for glass to break, and then sets the alarm off. Or you can get something like a shock sensor or a motion sensor, where there's actually a physical sensor in the car that if the car moves in any way, the alarm goes off. And one of the things about this car is it has a shock sensor, and the shock sensor is set really, really sensitively. So my expectation is that the electrical issue is actually that the alarm was set so sensitively that not only was the alarm itself draining the system, but also it was probably going off, at night when trucks are coming by and different things like that, and they're not realizing it, and then the alarm eventually shuts up, and that's slowly draining the battery. I was also told that there is some corrosion in the wiring harness. But I'm not exactly sure where. So what they told me was that this joint right here, this coolant joint, was leaking. It had a small crack in it, and it was allowing water to run down the harness, and it was collecting, they said, by the alternator, which is over here. So I might break this loom apart and take a look and see if I can find any corrosion. What's interesting is they said that they found, the mechanic said that they found corrosion in the harness. However, the harness is equally dirty from right to left, the entire length of the harness, and all of these factory clips are intact, which they're one-time use, they're not removable. So usually if something was taken apart, and this is all like factory wrapping that's been here for years, so it doesn't look like the harness was ever actually investigated, which is interesting. So maybe I'll find that it's a different area, and so I don't want to jump to that conclusion yet, but I think that they might have just been guessing based on the fact that this thing was leaking, this clip here, that that's what was causing the issue, when in fact it's likely the alarm. So I bought this car and it was about 3 hours away from my house. So I drove there in the Mercedes and I picked up a U-Haul tow dolly, and I towed it back with my Mercedes, the GLC, which went very well. Let's see what I need to take this apart quick so that I can not be talking through the entire video. So I towed it back with the GLC. It's been sitting in my driveway for a week and a half, and I haven't had any issues with it being dead. But I've left the alarm disarmed in my driveway, so that might have something to do with it too. All right, so what I'm going to do to start off is I'm going to take the dash down. So the aftermarket alarm is typically going to be installed up under the cluster, because you need to, there are certain things that you need, like a ignition wire and a starter wire, accessory wire, like those types of things, power and grounds to feed the alarm system, and those things tend to be available in this area. So most aftermarket companies are going to install them here. The exception would be if they were going to install something that was like a GPS tracker, like for you know, a U-Haul or a buy here, pay here kind of car dealer thing. You know, they might so I got 2 screws at the bottom. This just unsnaps and it kind of lifts up and out. There we go. So there's snaps there. Kind of see how it attaches. And then there's a clip here for the, it's probably the TPMS button. Yeah. Okay, so the exception would be like GPS tracker, where they're trying to hide that from the customer. So this has a Clifford alarm system in it. So let's see. So I'm going to need to split the steering column in half. I'll take this bar out of here. Just pull this out so that I can kind of see where I'm. Yeah, and I could see there's a relay in here, the brain. Okay, so over here we can see there's an aftermarket relay here. There's a couple places where they tapped in the harness, and then this is actually the alarm brain that's sitting right there. So I will say this looks like a fairly good install. It's clean. The person probably knew what they were doing, but also this alarm system's been in this car since before the company who sold it to me bought it, and that was, like I said, in like 2014 or 2015. So you know, it's highly likely that these things deteriorate over time, and sometimes the brains go bad, and they'll have like a phantom drain. They're using up some power. So take this out. just kind of put that back here out of the way. So now what I'm going to do is split the steering column in half. So I'll move the camera here so you can kind of see that. So a lot of steering columns have screws in the bottom or screws in the front, which are behind the steering wheel itself. This one has neither. They all have like a hinge in the back where the top and the bottom connect together. So you never want to split them from back to front. You always want to split them from front to back. That's how they're designed. That's how they're put on. There might be some exceptions to that rule, but I honestly can't think of one. So for this, I'm going to take a small flathead screwdriver, and what you'll see is behind in the corner there, there's like a hole. I'm going to stick this screwdriver in that hole, and it's going to allow me to split the column in half. So a lot of cars have steering wheel locks. So when you turn the steering wheel one way or the other with the key off, it's going to lock. So to combat that, you can just turn the key on. So in this case, I got it apart, pull this down, that's out of the way. If for any reason you mar this edge, which like I didn't, but if for any reason you mar this edge, you can give it a little heat with a heat gun and kind of push it back. It's a pretty flexible piece of plastic. If the steering wheel's locked, you can turn the key on and that'll allow you to turn it like that. So next, so if we look here, see a couple different things. So here's the main harness that goes up and feeds the ignition, and underneath it, zip tied to it, is this wiring harness, which is going to be what feeds our alarm. So we'll start with that. Most people are going to install an alarm. It's going to be like a spider that all goes back to the brain, and they'll kind of create these looms of wires that go to different sections of the car, like the brake pedal or the fuse box or the ignition. So we'll split that, and we'll start disconnecting that section. All right, so clip this, and then we can unplug this harness here to give us a little bit more room to work, because some of these cables are short. We'll take a knife, and we're just going to very carefully slice through this tape so that we can kind of see what we're looking at. All right. So they didn't do a bad job on the installation, but I've seen better, I've seen worse. There are some things here that I don't really care for. So this tape job is kind of crappy, but they soldered things together, which is good. So, you know, these wires are the ones that are supposed to go into this plug from the factory, right? And the way a lot of aftermarket alarms work is they'll interrupt a wire. In this case, it's this double white wire, which is probably what feeds the starter motor. And they'll interrupt that so that if you get in the car and you break the ignition and you turn it, it won't start with the alarm system armed. Sometimes what ends up happening, though, is that the aftermarket alarm system will fail and it'll leave a person stranded because the wire that feeds the starter is interrupted. So that's something that, it's not incredibly common, but it's common enough. I removed, you know, a fair amount of aftermarket alarms over the years when I worked at Sound Solutions because of that. And that was the original request. So we're going to clip this and we're going to clip that and just kind of get this harness out of the way. So next we'll just kind of cut this back or remove this bit of heat shrink from the cable. So this one wire that was just kind of tapped into, I removed the connection and now I'm just going to tape it up. And like I mentioned in the car stereo video, the only electrical tape worth buying is 3M or Scotch Super 33. It's Super 33 Plus. It is by far the best. It's what we used for all of our installations for years and years and years. Never run into issues with it failing. It's just, it is superior to other tapes. It has a very good heat range, both low and high. And it's super high-end tape. All right, so basically what I'm doing here is I'm connecting the wires back that were broken by the alarm system and twisting them back together. So you'll see that's kind of what it looks like. I'm going to get my soldering gun and I'm going to put a little bit of solder on that. You know, you don't have to solder every single connection, but when we have something like this, that's a critical harness where a wire was physically broken, I like to solder it back together because if it ever comes disconnected for a future owner, the car's not going to start. It's going to be a situation where the car needs to be towed to somebody who can figure out what's going on. You know, and for a mechanic who might not know that this system ever existed, it's actually a fairly difficult thing to diagnose. they'll look at the starter motor, they'll think there's a problem with the starter motor, they might even replace the starter motor and find out that, oh, that didn't solve your problem. And then you dive in a little bit more, and eventually they'll find the culprit. But this is a car that's worth $3,000-$4,000 at most. So if somebody goes and spends that on it, they probably don't have the the expendable income to be paying a mechanic to figure out what's up. Or it would at least be a stretch for them. So try to, even though it's a car that I intend on flipping and selling, I'm not here to sell somebody a problem. Try to give people something that I'd want don't put someone else's kid in a situation that you wouldn't want your own kid to be in, I guess is probably the best way to look at it, right? This is the kind of car that my daughter would drive. Like, she doesn't have the money to pay for something like this. Why would I want to do that to someone else's kid? So I've got my torch hot butane soldering iron, so I'm just going to get a little bit of solder here on it. And I said not a ton, just enough that it's going to be a reliable connection. So there's the finished connection, and I'll tape this up, make it nice and tight. If you have heat shrink, you can put heat shrink over it. Heat shrink is a little hard on connections that you're soldering because the solder, or the soldering iron heats up the copper. Sometimes the insulation will make the heat shrink start to shrink prematurely before you're ready for it. So I normally just use electrical tape. Just don't go crazy with your solder, and that way you won't end up with like big blobs or sharp spots or anything like that could potentially be a problem. Poking through the insulation of the tape or the wires next to it. So there's my finished harness. I see another harness right here that doesn't have any tape on it. It was probably untaped by the previous installer. So I'll just clean that up a little bit. From the factory, most harnesses are going to be taped or be loomed, depending on whether or not they're riding against metal or other things. So just try to leave things the way that you found them. The manufacturers spend a lot of time and money designing these harnesses to be reliable and dependable, and something that they don't have to deal with problems with. And I've seen some stupid things in the past from a manufacturing perspective, like the entire General Motors family comes to mind. They all have horrendous electrical systems. They're just disgusting. And I take that with a grain of salt, I guess, because I'll be honest, I haven't really worked on anything post 2014 in the GM family, so maybe they're better now that they're no longer made in the United States, but I doubt it. So, so this harness is removed. So next, what we want to do is just kind of follow this back. So what we see here is it goes up, and it kind of connects here. There's a zip tie, so I'm just going to cut that zip tie down. You do want to be careful when you're cutting these cable ties that you don't accidentally nick or cut through a harness, especially one that is staying in the vehicle. So we'll just kind of, I unclip this harness, we'll pull it down a little bit, see what we're dealing with. Here's another zip tie, kind of way up high. I'm sorry, I realize that it's not easy to see on video. I could try pulling more of this dash down. Let me see if I can get a better view for the camera. Okay. Remove this. One plug. So that just unsnapped. Alright, so that gives us a little bit better view. So we can see kind of what we're dealing with. So this is the aftermarket harness I just removed. You can see there's a relay here, there's another relay here. There's some connections into the fuse box, and then here's the brain for the actual unit here, this box here. So I'm just going to continue removing the zip ties. You can tell the aftermarket zip ties from the factory zip ties. The aftermarket zip ties are kind of like a standard plastic zip tie. The factory ones are going to be like these, where they've got the mounting brackets on them. So they tend to be fairly easy to tell apart. You can always add more zip ties in the future if you need to tidy it up when you're done. So when we're talking about the components of an alarm system, we've got this brain, which is kind of the main controller that has everything in it. There's the antenna, which is this guy. It's usually up on the windshield. Sometimes it'll be over here. Sometimes creative people will hide them under the dash. Truly, if they're hidden under the dash, they have shorter range for the remote, so most installers don't do that. And they put them on the windshield unless they're requested to do so by a customer. This is the antenna cable that I'm removing right here. So I'm actually just going to cut this because I'm not going to use this again. So I'll just cut it and remove it. So I can I'll pull the antenna down in a bit because my hands have black crap all over them. So if we're looking at the spider web that is this harness, what we see is there's a section that goes down near the kick panel. There's going to be a section that goes under the hood, and the under the hood section is what's going to run like the siren that's under the hood or connect to the horn sometimes, or maybe there's a hood pin. There's some stuff that connects right here Like this red wire is getting power for the entire system. So this is like a main power plug in a Toyota that feeds this entire fuse box. So something like this, we'll untape this. We'll be frustrated that they soldered it. And then basically pull on it a little bit, clip this wire as flat as possible, and then tape up this harness. And the reason I don't like soldering when you're tapping into harnesses like this is because you end up with this big blob at the end that's sharp. And that sharp blob has the ability to cut through the tape and touch wires that are around it. Just not cool. So there's our power wire. I'm going to put a second piece of tape over that joint. One, because it's solder and sharp, but also number two, because it's like the main power connector for the entire interior of the car, and if it shorts out, it's just going to blow a giant fuse under your hood that most people aren't going to have handy. And again, it's something that could cause a failure to start event. So let me cut this harness a little bit, try to give myself some more room to work. Okay, so brains out of here. Now we're just going to remove each of these individual wires. So what we'll see are things like this. There's this white wire here, and it's attached to a harness here from the factory. So we can kind of undo this tape, and we'll find a joint like that. It's not pretty. And we'll cut the white out of here, being careful not to cut the green cable. And then we'll tape that up. In some cases, it's going to be easier to unplug this harness than it is to, tape it up where it sits. But in other cases, they really don't give you a lot of additional cable in these harnesses from the factory, so you don't have the ability to do a whole lot with it, even if you do unclip it. It maybe gives you an extra half an inch. So when you're doing this a lot on a regular day-to-day basis, there are certain tools of the trade that become invaluable. Those snap blade knives, I like Olfa brand. At least having Olfa blades. If you have another brand, like I'm using a Husky one today, but I actually have an Olfa branded knife as well. But the Olfa stainless steel blades are awesome. They stay sharp, they don't rust. You just have to be careful. You cut yourself, pretty easily in some of these tight spaces, especially if you're trying to like cut a zip tie or something like that. There's a screw that they put in for a ground. Unscrew that. I'm sorry if the video isn't showing a whole lot. I'm trying to just get all of these harnesses here so that I can figure out what I have to remove. Okay. So let's kind of go over what I'm left with here. So I have the antenna harness, which is here. I cut that off because I don't want to reuse it. And that goes up and around to that. So we can pull that out. Usually it's going to be behind this weather strip, so this weather strip is just going to pull. We'll see it's kind of right here. Many cars have airbags in these pillars. This one does, curtain airbag. So you need to be careful when you're installing these types of systems to be behind the airbag and not in front of the airbag. Truthfully, the airbag is strong enough to demolish any sort of cable, but I've seen before where people run them in front of the airbag and you're just going to end up with the airbag being less effective or ripping the cable off the roof or whatever in the event of an accident. So always try to make sure to not mess with any safety systems. Anybody who does what I did long enough, you stay away from every single yellow connector. This yellow connector right here, that's airbag. They're always yellow, they're always loomed in yellow. They're always, you know, that's an airbag, and you just leave it alone. Anytime you have to unplug one of those for any reason, disconnect the battery first and leave it disconnected until it's plugged back in. It's just not a good idea to mess around with any sort of airbag systems. Many cars require dealer scan tools in order to fix airbag problems, or to reset the system. Even if you plug everything back in and you connected everything appropriately, you still might need to pay a dealer to plug their tool in. And some, like Autel and Zurich and stuff like that, some of those tools can do some SRS stuff, but that's only for certain cars. So we're going to remove this kick panel here, right here where my hand is. There's usually a plastic nut here. It's missing, so it's probably left off by the last guy who was in here. And what do we find? So here are our harnesses. So we see our blue and green. Blue and green are lock and unlock wires from the brain. So this is where they tapped into the door lock. So this is actually the harness that goes to the door right here, and it kind of plugs in. So that way, if a mechanic has to replace your door, they get a door from another car. The door already has the harness built in, and they stick the harness through the door hole. It comes out here, and then they just plug it in. Car parts are designed to be modular. Cars are designed to be repairable. So you know, things like extremities, like your doors, are designed to be plugged in, unplugged. So here's my my lock and unlock wires from the door. So these would actually correspond to the buttons in the driver door that you can press to lock and unlock the cars. Not every car needs lock and unlock connected to an aftermarket alarm. Sometimes they'll use these modules that can talk to the vehicle computers, and they can interact with them that way. Specifically if you're doing like a remote car starter and you need to bypass a chip inside a key. So sometimes you'll see, you'll be removing an alarm and you won't see these wires touched because they can talk to the CAN bus inside the car and communicate with the car that way. And you could see like that this harness loom was cut by the person who was in here, but they didn't really like patch it up when they were done. And these are signs that somebody worked in the car and messed with the electrical system. So, and it's not that this guy did a bad job. I'd probably give him an 8 out of 10. Most people that install electronics are paid piece rate, like full commission. So it ends up being one of those things where, like, good, cheap, fast, you can pick any two. You can have somebody who's good and fast, but you're going to pay for it. You can have something that's fast and cheap. It's not as good. That's often what you run into with these types of things. What we'll do here is we'll take this factory loom right there. We'll tape it up. And what's silly is this factory loom actually has like a side that's adhesive together, and you could just unhook it and then rehook it when you're done. It's almost like opening up a piece of Velcro. So they didn't even need to cut it, but they did. So now I have to tape it up because I don't have any other way to put it back together. So it's dumb, but whatever. Just verify that our buttons work. But so that's that one. It's kind of what it looks like when it's finished. This is what it looked like from the start. That's what it would have been originally. This one was cut, but realistically, all they had to do, let's use this one as an example. It's never been touched. Open this up. This is adhesive, so you can actually just split it apart like that, work on your wires, and when you're done, you just stick it back together, and it goes right back together, and everything's cool. I don't know why they didn't do that. Somebody who does this for a living should know that. And this wire kind of runs across the footwell here. That's interesting. This is probably going over to the passenger side. It's probably the passenger side door pin, maybe? Not sure. So, what else do we have here? So this is another loom that was cut, wasn't put back together. So these must be door pins for the rear, and they diode isolated them. Okay, that makes sense. So in some cars, when I refer to a door pin, I'm referring to the button that is depressed when the door is shut. That turns the dome light on or off. And some cars have one door pin that is shared between all of the doors. So if any door is open, this light goes on, or this wire is activated. This Toyota must not. So what they ended up doing was they found the door pins for the rear door and the front door, which are here, and they used diodes to isolate them so that they could feed the same wire, and that way the dash, like, you don't want to tie wires together that are physically separate from the factory, because you'll end up with errors and problems and the car will freak out. So that's why there's like a diode wired in here. So it's just kind of the same thing. I cut the wire out, tape the wire up, clean everything up. To be careful with these Toyotas, they have really thin wires in these harnesses. They're always kind of a pain in the butt to work on. They're super reliable cars, so I'm not knocking their build quality. I think that they do a good job. It's just they're hard to manipulate from an aftermarket perspective in comparison to like a Honda that generally uses higher gauge wiring, or you know, a Ford or something else. GM uses thin gauge cables too. My biggest gripe with them is they make kind of stupid decisions. They have like these multi-part fuse boxes under the hood that have problems, or they put like these joints under the floor mats from the factory where harnesses are joined together, and then they get water in there because the sunroofs leak or the drains get clogged or whatever, and then those connections rot. Or they put body control modules in places that get wet. So they're just, we always had electrical issues with older GMs. But again, to be fair, I haven't really messed around with one of them in a while, so here they cut a wire in half. They interrupted this wire, this red wire. So what I did was I cut one past the butt connector and the other one here. I'm just going to connect these two together and then tie them up. Kind of the idea here is that you want to end up with a wire that's about the same length as it was from the factory. So yeah, there's two joints in it. Now, one great question is, why did they spend the time to solder all of these cables that didn't really need to be soldered? But then something like this, that makes a lot of sense to solder, they used a butt connector for, which doesn't match what they did under the dash with the same exact situation. Oh well. I guess if you look at anything that anybody does ever, you can always find something to critique, so. Just waiting for my soldering iron to heat up a little bit here. Cool. I've always liked the butane soldering iron because they're super hot. So they make it really easy to kind of quickly get in and get out. A lot of times if you're doing something that's a more complicated installation, because the butane eventually runs out, so you can't leave them running all the time, you just get a plug-in one like a little Weller and connect it to the cord reel and kind of sit it next to the car and just leave it plugged in. But the butane ones do better with larger gauge wires and things that require a little bit more heat than the plug-in electric ones do, unless you're using a big gun. So I'll just tape this harness up like it was from the factory. We'll put it back in this clip here that it was in from the factory, which it wasn't. And then I've kind of always tried to have a high attention to detail when doing these things. Put harnesses back where they came from, wrap them up like they looked like from the factory, put them in the factory clips. You know, it should look like you were never in there. So I'm in the factory clips, the factory harness. I can put this footwell back in. It's a bummer that there's no screw for it. There's supposed to be a screw that holds it in right here, but there's also a plastic clip that's missing. But also sometimes you take cars apart and things break. They don't go back together the way they came. I mean, the guy that put this in there, if we ended up with some spare parts, I guess he technically made the car more efficient. So what's left here? So we've got one more harness here, this little guy that goes through the firewall right here. So that's our under the hood harness, and this one which goes over the passenger side. So let's look at the under the hood one. So our under the hood harness is going to be back here. It's this guy. So where does that come through? Okay, so we can pull that through. So it came through this main loom here where all the other wiring harness stuff was. Through here. And it connects to this zip tie. And here's the siren, this guy right here. So that's the part that goes, you know, plays the song. Woo, woo, that noise. So we'll get that removed. And really, this right here isn't stopping us from putting our dash back together, testing things out, but so just grab a pair of cutters. So we're going to cut the zip tie here, and then I'm also going to cut the wire here. And then we can get our siren out. Here's our siren. Put that there with the rest of our crap. And then we have the wire that goes over to the passenger side. And what we're probably going to find is over here, we're going to connect to 2 wires in the kick panel. And those 2 wires are going to be diode isolated from each other. And they'll be the 2 door pins from this side. There might be 3 if there's also a trunk pin that is separate. So let's see. So here's our green wire. It's all the way across. Pull that out of here. And what do we find? Here's a diode. Here's another diode. And they're tapped into 2 wires, green and brown. And those are our door pins. So we can cut these guys out. And we can try to get a better view here. Remove all this old tape. There we go. And then we'll remove this old tape. And we'll just tape these up nice and tight. We'll tape up the harness. So, as I mentioned earlier, I removed a lot of aftermarket alarms because they would cause problems for people over time. And there's a variety of systems that they connect to, and they're universal, so they're supposed to work with any car. That's what they're designed for. So they make them really universal. And not every car is the same. They don't even, like, some cars don't even do things the same way. Meaning, for some cars, there's a wire that gets grounded in the frame to light the dome light, for example. In some cars, there's power through those wires all the time, and there's a switch that connects 2 wires together. And, like, not everybody electrically does things the same way across brands. So these alarm systems have to work with everybody, and they tie into, you know, in this case, we tied into the ignition, we tied into the starter wire, we tied into a door pins in 4 places. One of the wires that I cut out was probably a trunk pin of some sort, or there just was no trunk protection on the car. That's also possibly the case. It ties into the lock and unlock wires to be able to lock and unlock the door from the aftermarket remote. There's a siren under the hood. Sometimes they'll put in a hood pin to detect whether or not the hood is actually open. The alarm needs power, it needs ground. So what can happen over time as the alarm system gets old, as electrical components break down, as maybe the computer has an issue or something, because it is just a little computer, that brain, that metal box, it might develop a short. Relays and switches that are inside it might not be as solid as they used to be. They might allow some electricity to flow when they're not supposed to. So you can end up with some phantom draws. You can end up with problems where, like, one component is causing things to kind of bleed together. Like we saw all of those door pins, they all go back to the same wire. They're separated by diodes, which the diode's job is to keep them electrically isolated. But if one of those diodes fails, then all of a sudden your door pins are tied together, which means the factory brain from the car is talking to itself, and sometimes that can cause it to freak out, turn your dome light on when the door isn't actually open, things like that. So these systems aren't perfect. Many of them have a lifetime warranty, but it's the lifetime of the car owner owning the vehicle, and the average person in the United States owns a car for 3 years or less. So because of that, the warranty doesn't really have to be in place for very long for a lot of these systems. It's just kind of what they bank on. So that's in place. This is in place, so we'll put the steering column back together. And then Alright, so our column is back together. With this stuff, you just take it easy, make sure that you're plugging in all of the harnesses, like this stupid little tire pressure thing. You don't plug this one wire in and all of a sudden you've got a light on your dash. If it's a wire related to airbag, potentially worse problems. It's highly unlikely that you would have an airbag go off without being in an accident, but there's the potential for you to have an airbag system fault or something like that. So that's that. That's that. Now I just want to kind of test every system that I touched. So lock, unlock. I can hear all the locks actually working. I want to turn the car on. I'm just going to test things like the windows because I unplugged the door. I was in the harnesses and stuff. Make sure that our mirror buttons work because I unplugged that. That works fine. Just kind of test everything around where you were. Tire pressure switch is down there. Start the car. Make sure it starts. Make sure we have no lights. The seatbelt light, because I'm not wearing my seatbelt, but everything else seems good. Cool. So, what I'd like to check out next because again, I don't believe that there are actually electrical issues here, but who knows, maybe there are. I'd like to okay, so I'm at 1396 from the alternator, which is good. This is drive-by-wire, so I can't just pull the throttle body open and see if it goes up, but that looks good. I definitely have some work to do on this car. Stickers to remove and stuff like that. So work on some more things here shortly. But that's it for this. I'll test it out and let you know how it works out.